10 years. That is how long the research shows it can take, on average, for someone with Sjögren's disease to go from their very first symptom to the correct diagnosis on a chart. Not 10 years to find a cure, because one still doesn't exist. 10 years just to get the right name written down. I have read a lot of autoimmune research in my time doing this work, and that number still stops me every single time I say it out loud. I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. I did not want to make this video. Not because the information is complicated, but because once you actually lay it out end to end, it stops looking like an unfortunate series of missed appointments and starts looking like something closer to a system that was allowed to fail people, over and over, for almost a century, and mostly got away with it. I'm going to call that gap what I think it actually is. I call it the Sika gap. Sika is the medical term for the dryness at the center of this disease, and the gap is everything that happens, or doesn't happen, in the years between that dryness showing up and someone finally being taken seriously about it. Once you know the term, you're going to start seeing it everywhere in this story. Somewhere right now, there is a woman sitting in a waiting room for the 11th time this year. Sent from her family doctor to an eye doctor. From the eye doctor to a dentist. From the dentist to a rheumatologist with a 6-month wait list. Told it's stress. Told it's menopause. Told, more than once, to consider talking to someone about her anxiety. Meanwhile, her own immune system has been quietly and systematically destroying the glands that make her tears and her saliva, for years, while every single person she asked for help sent her somewhere else. She is not alone in the Sika gap. A few states over, there is a man in his 30s whose burning hands and feet get called carpal tunnel, then anxiety, then nothing at all, because his nerve tests kept coming back normal. In another city, a 19-year-old has been coughing for 2 years, cycling through inhalers for asthma that never fully responds, because nobody has connected her lungs to her eyes and her eyes to her mouth and her mouth to a disease that was hiding the whole time in plain sight. None of them know each other. None of them have compared notes. And yet if you sat all 3 of them down in the same room, you'd hear the same rhythm repeat itself. A symptom shows up. A doctor offers the least alarming explanation available. It doesn't go away. A second, seemingly unrelated symptom shows up somewhere else. A second doctor in a completely different specialty offers a second unrelated explanation. Nobody in that chain is ever handed the full picture, because nobody is required to look at the full picture. That's not bad luck happening to 3 unlucky people. According to the researchers who track this, that's closer to the average case. And an average case that takes years to solve isn't a coincidence anymore. It's a pattern with a name. It's the Sika gap. Let's get into exactly how it was built. Here's the biology in plain terms, because you needed to understand why the Sika gap exists at all. In Sjögren's disease, white blood cells called lymphocytes start infiltrating the body's moisture-producing glands, mainly the tear glands and the salivary glands. Once inside, they trigger chronic, low-grade inflammation, releasing signaling proteins called cytokines that keep the immune system locked in an ongoing, unnecessary attack. This isn't a single event. It's not an infection that flares and resolves. It's a slow, grinding process that can run in the background for years before it produces symptoms specific enough to land someone in a rheumatologist's office instead of an eye doctor's or a dentist's. That slow, spread-out nature is exactly what makes this disease so easy to miss, and exactly why the Sika gap isn't bad luck. It's close to the expected outcome of a healthcare system built around specialists who each examine one organ in isolation, evaluating a disease that was never going to announce itself through just one organ. Over time, the same immune activity can move through the joints, the nerves, the skin, the lungs, and the kidneys, and it raises the lifetime risk of a specific blood cancer, lymphoma, to a level far higher than the general population. We'll come back to that number, because it's one of the ones that made me stop and reread this research 3 separate times before I believed it. Current estimates put the number of adults living with Sjögren's in the United States around 3 million, and more than 90% of them are women, most often diagnosed somewhere between their 40s and 60s, even though the disease itself frequently starts decades earlier. That space between when it starts and when it's finally named is the Sika gap in action, and multiple independent research groups, studying different populations in different countries, keep landing on strikingly similar numbers for how wide it actually is. One large patient survey found an average delay of nearly 6 years. A separate clinical study measured it at just under 6 years as well, with half of all patients waiting at least 2 years and a smaller group waiting far longer. Research out of a major Canadian university found a median delay of 4 years, with some patients waiting as long as 28. And patient advocacy groups tracking Zika-dominant cases, where dry eyes or dry mouth show up before anything else, found an average of about 10 years passes before the underlying autoimmune cause finally gets connected. I built something specifically for not just tracking and doctor's appointment. It is called Sjögren's Ultimate Symptom Map and Diagnostic Action Plan, and it walks you through exactly which symptoms to track not just for Sjögren but also for MS and RA. Drop symptom map in the comment, and I would send the link for you to access it. Let's get back to the research. That's the number from the cold open. Now you know exactly where it comes from. To understand how the Zika gap got built, you have to go back further than you'd expect. Sjögren's disease was first formally described in the medical literature in the 1930s, by an ophthalmologist who noticed a cluster of women presenting with severe dry eyes alongside joint pain and dry mouth. Nearly a century of formal medical awareness. And for most of that century, conditions that showed up primarily in women, with symptoms that didn't appear on an X-ray or confirm with one simple blood test, were treated with a different level of suspicion than conditions that showed up primarily in men. Fatigue, dryness, and joint pain without dramatic visible swelling were, for decades, filed under vague categories. Nerves. Stress. Hormones. Getting older. Going back further, hysteria, a word with a well-documented and genuinely ugly history of being used almost exclusively against women whose symptoms doctors couldn't immediately explain, and often didn't try very hard to. Ask almost anyone in a Sjögren's patient community how long it took them to get diagnosed, and you'll hear some version of the same story from strangers who've never met. Years of being told nothing is wrong. Years of normal-looking blood work treated as the final answer instead of the opening question. Years of being filed under difficult, dramatic, or anxious, instead of correctly, under sick. Nearly a century of awareness. Still averaging years, sometimes decades, of delay. That's not a knowledge gap or better textbook fixes. That's a pattern of dismissal quietly built into the profession, one skeptical appointment at a time, until it stopped looking like bias and just started looking like standard practice. If I had to point to one specific mechanism inside the Zika gap and say, this is the piece I am most angry about, it would be this one. For decades, one of the primary ways to confirm a Sjögren's diagnosis was testing the blood for two specific antibodies, called SSA and SSB. Antibodies present, doctors moved forward with confidence. Antibodies absent, a huge number of patients were sent home and told their symptoms simply didn't add up to Sjögren's, even when nearly everything else about their case pointed straight at it. Here's what that single test missed. A meaningful share of people who genuinely have Sjögren's, later confirmed through more invasive testing like a minor salivary gland biopsy from the inner lip, are what the research calls seronegative. Their antibody blood work comes back negative even while the disease is actively present and actively destroying their glands. For years, an entire group of patients were told, in effect, that because one vial of blood came back clean, there was nothing more worth looking into, while the physical evidence of ongoing damage sat right there in front of anyone willing to look past that one result. Diagnostic criteria have slowly expanded to way more than that single test, folding in a formal dry eye exam, a lip biopsy, and salivary flow testing into a combined score. Slowly is the operative word. For an entire generation, one incomplete test effectively became the whole case, and when it came back clean, real, ongoing, worsening symptoms got dismissed in people who were, in every meaningful sense, still getting sicker in front of the very system meant to be watching. Even now, seronegative but symptomatic patients frequently describe seeing 7 or more specialists before diagnosis, according to population-level data, before anyone is willing to look past a single lab value. And women, specifically, are documented to average more physician visits than men on the road to the same diagnosis. Same disease. Longer road, if you're a woman walking it. This next part might be the most damning piece of the whole Zika gap, because it's not about one test or one appointment. It's about an entire field choosing, for decades, not to look. As of this recording, there is no FDA-approved medication anywhere in the United States that treats the underlying disease process of Sjögren's. Not one. Everything currently prescribed manages individual symptoms, or is borrowed off-label from the treatment playbooks of lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, medications built, tested, and approved for a completely different disease and simply handed down here because nothing else existed. People who've spent their careers inside Sjögren's research describe the recent history bluntly. As recently as about 15 years ago, there were essentially no clinical trials running specifically for this disease, and pharmaceutical companies showed almost no interest in it, partly because a wave of related lupus drug trials had been failing one after another, which made the entire category look unattractive to investors. Sjögren's, sharing biological overlap with those failing trials, got quietly deprioritized right alongside them, despite being its own distinct disease affecting millions of people who had nothing to do with those other failures. That underinvestment did not happen because this disease is rare. It affects a comparable, and by some estimates larger, population than several autoimmune diseases that have received dramatically more research funding and pharmaceutical attention for far longer. It happened because a disease that mostly damages quality of life, instead of showing up dramatically on a single scan, got treated by the research world as the quieter relative in the room. Uncomfortable enough to complain about. Not visible enough, apparently, to fund. That's finally starting to shift. In just the past few years, multiple treatments have entered late-stage trials, several sitting in phase 3 right now, any one of which could become the first disease-modifying therapy this condition has ever had. That is genuinely good news. But sit with what it means that it's news at all. A condition serious enough to raise a patient's lifetime cancer risk has gone this long, decades past its formal medical description, without a single approved treatment built for it specifically. Whichever one crosses the finish line first will be the first one ever. There's a quieter mechanism inside the sicker gap that almost never gets talked about. Roughly half of all Sjögren's patients don't have it alone. It's layered on top of, or tangled together with, another autoimmune condition, most often lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. On paper, that overlap should make diagnosis easier, since a patient already under a rheumatologist's care for one autoimmune disease seems like an obvious candidate to be screened for a second one hiding in the same immune system. In practice, the opposite happens more often. Symptoms get absorbed into the existing diagnosis instead of investigated separately. Dry eyes get chalked up to medication side effects. Fatigue gets chalked up to the disease already on the chart. And a second condition, carrying its own distinct risks including that elevated lymphoma risk, can sit undiagnosed for years specifically because it's hiding in the shadow of a diagnosis the patient already has. It also means a large share of Sjögren's patients are, in practice, treated entirely with medications designed for someone else's disease. Not because those medications are useless, many genuinely help, but because the system has never been forced to build something designed for this condition from the ground up. A borrowed treatment plan is still, in a very real sense, an unanswered case. There's a part of this story that almost never gets discussed next to the medical timeline, and that's the financial toll of simply trying to get someone to take you seriously. Sjögren's patients average significantly more physician visits before diagnosis than patients with many other chronic conditions, cycling through general practitioners, optometrists, dentists, ENT specialists, neurologists, and rheumatologists, often years before a rheumatologist is even the first one to hear the full list of symptoms in one sitting. Every one of those visits carries a cost. A copay here. A referral fee there. Time off work for appointments that end in reassurance instead of answers. For patients without strong insurance, or in systems where specialist access means long waits or heavy out-of-pocket spending, that burden compounds year after year, on top of a body getting sicker and a bank account getting thinner at the same time. By the time a real diagnosis arrives, many patients have spent years, and often thousands of dollars, chasing an answer the system itself should have found far faster. That's not a footnote. That's part of the harm. A slow, disorganized diagnostic process doesn't just cost time. It quietly transfers real financial hardship onto the exact people the system was supposed to protect. One more mechanism worth naming, because it concerns who even gets studied in the first place. Recent analysis of Sjögren's clinical trials found recruitment heavily concentrated in North America and Europe, with no trials recruiting from the African continent and none including countries with a medium or low human development index. The data behind every treatment currently in development has been built almost entirely from a narrow slice of the global population, even though this disease does not limit itself to that slice. Underrepresented populations have, in other autoimmune diseases like lupus, been documented to experience more severe disease courses. If that holds true here too, and there's little structural reason to assume it wouldn't, then the patients who may need the most urgent attention are the ones least represented in the research meant to eventually help them. Here is what years spent inside the Sika gap actually does, system by system. 1. The eyes. Chronic dryness left unmanaged can progress to corneal damage, scarring, recurrent infections, and in advanced cases, permanent vision changes that earlier intervention could have significantly slowed. Many patients spend years relying on nothing but over-the-counter drops, never told the dryness they were quietly managing alone was a diagnosable medical condition. 2. The mouth and teeth. Saliva buffers acid and washes away bacteria constantly, all day, without you ever thinking about it. Years without enough of it causes rapid tooth decay, painful oral infections, and sometimes tooth loss in patients who had healthy dental habits their whole lives before the disease took that protection away. 3. The joints. Ongoing inflammation can mimic, and sometimes genuinely overlap with, rheumatoid arthritis, causing swelling and pain frequently written off as aging or overuse for years before anyone connects it to an autoimmune cause. 4. The nerves. A meaningful subset of patients develop small fiber neuropathy, a burning, electric shock pain in the hands and feet, caused by immune damage to the smallest nerve fibers. It's frequently dismissed as anxiety because standard nerve tests, built to measure larger fibers, often come back completely normal while the smaller ones are actively being damaged. 5. The lungs and kidneys. In advanced cases, the same immune attack can move into these organs, causing inflammation that, left alone, leads to permanent structural damage. 6. The gut. Reduced moisture and altered motility cause chronic reflux, trouble swallowing, and digestive discomfort routinely blamed on diet or stress for years before anyone considers the autoimmune cause underneath it. 7. The skin and blood vessels. Some patients develop Raynaud's phenomenon, where fingers and toes turn white or blue in cold or stress, alongside dry, painful skin changes, both frequently dismissed as unrelated cosmetic or circulatory nuisances. 8. The mind. Chronic inflammation and poor sleep from pain produce measurable brain fog, alongside significantly elevated rates of anxiety and depression. Quality of life research puts the burden on par with rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, and yet because Sjögren's rarely gets treated with the same urgency, that psychological toll frequently goes unacknowledged for just as long as the physical symptoms. 9. And this is the one that makes every year of delay matter most, the lymphatic system. Sjögren's carries one of the highest relative lymphoma risks of any autoimmune disease on record, with some research placing it more than 15 times higher than the general population. Years undiagnosed means years without the monitoring that risk requires. In a disease where early detection of a secondary cancer can be the difference between manageable and devastating, a diagnostic delay is never neutral. It's the mechanism through which real harm gets allowed to happen. None of this was inevitable. Nearly all of it gets worse specifically because of delay, and more survivable specifically because of early recognition. The numbers land differently once you see how they actually play out. These are 3 composite stories, built from patterns reported again and again across patient communities and published research, not any one person, but a fair representation of how the Sika gap shows up, over and over, in different bodies, different cities, different decades. Story 1. A woman notices dry eyes in her late 30s. Assumes it's screen time. 2 years later her mouth starts feeling persistently dry at night. 3 years after that, her joints start aching, moving around her body, never settling long enough for any one doctor to name it. She's told it's stress, possibly early menopause, once, directly, that she might benefit from seeing someone about anxiety. It takes a dentist noticing unusually rapid decay across several teeth in one visit, and asking about dry mouth, to finally get her referred to a rheumatologist. 6 years, start to finish. Story 2. A man in his early 30s develops burning, tingling feet that creep toward his ankles over a year. Nerve testing comes back normal, so he's told it's stress or mild nerve hypersensitivity. He turns out seronegative when finally tested years later, delaying serious consideration of Sjögren's even further. Only a persistent rheumatologist ordering a lip biopsy, because nothing else fits the pattern, confirms it. Just over 5 years. Story 3. A teenager develops a chronic cough treated repeatedly as asthma and allergies. Inhalers help a little, never fully. Years later, in her 20s, dry eyes start interfering with reading and night driving. One new eye doctor asks a single extra question: any dryness in the mouth, any unexplained joint pain, and the pattern finally gets flagged. The diagnosis retroactively explains nearly a decade of respiratory symptoms nobody had connected to anything. 3 ages. 3 genders. 3 completely different entry points into the healthcare system. 1 identical outcome. Years inside the sicker gap before anyone put the pieces together. So who's actually responsible for a gap like this? There's no single villain behind one desk. There's a lineup of contributing factors, and understanding each one is part of what protects you, or someone you love, going forward. 1. Outdated diagnostic reliance. A system that leaned too heavily, too long, on a single incomplete blood test, leaving an entire seronegative population undiagnosed and unmonitored despite active disease. 2. Research underinvestment. A disease affecting millions that spent a documented stretch of recent history with almost no dedicated clinical trials and almost no pharmaceutical interest, resulting in 0 approved disease-modifying treatments after nearly a century of awareness. 3. Gendered dismissal woven into the culture of medicine. A documented historical pattern where symptoms disproportionately reported by women were more likely attributed to stress or hormones before a physical cause was fully investigated. A pattern with roots stretching back to when unexplained female symptoms were formally labeled hysteria. 4. The diagnostic overlap trap. A system where one autoimmune diagnosis frequently causes a second, coexisting one to be absorbed or dismissed as more of the same, rather than investigated on its own terms. 5. The invisible nature of the disease itself. A condition that rarely shows up dramatically in a rushed 10-minute exam, making it easy for the true severity to be underestimated by anyone who isn't living inside that exact body every day. 6. The education gap sitting upstream of all the others. As recently as the middle of the last decade, only a single medical school in the entire United States had a dedicated lecture built specifically around this disease. You cannot expect a system to diagnose quickly what its own training programs barely taught it to look for. None of these 6 factors are one doctor in one room deliberately choosing to ignore someone. This is bigger than any one appointment. It's a system that, brick by brick, funding cycle by funding cycle, curriculum by curriculum, made years of delay almost structurally guaranteed for millions of people, most of them women, most of them told for years that what they felt didn't add up to anything real. I don't want to leave you with only the outrage, because outrage without a next step just turns into another closed file. If any part of this sounded like your own body, here is exactly what to bring into your next appointment. Ask specifically to be evaluated using the combined classification criteria, not the antibody test alone. Say the words seronegative Sjögren's out loud and ask whether a lip biopsy or salivary flow testing has ever been discussed for you. If you have burning or tingling in your hands or feet that a standard nerve conduction test called normal, ask about small fiber neuropathy testing specifically, since it requires a different kind of test entirely. And if you already carry another autoimmune diagnosis, ask directly whether your dryness, fatigue, or joint pain has ever been separately evaluated, or whether it has only ever been assumed to be part of the diagnosis you already have. You are not being difficult by asking these questions. You are closing your own gap faster than the system was ever built to close it for you. If you've spent years being told nothing is wrong while your body kept insisting otherwise, this video was built for you. You were not imagining it. You were not being dramatic. You were living inside a body full of evidence that took far too long for the rest of the world to read correctly. That is the biggest crime in the history of Sjögren's disease. Not one villain behind one desk. Decades of a system that kept moving past the evidence before it had even finished coming in, and millions of people who paid for that with years of their lives. There is a real, honest note of good news to end on. More rheumatologists are being trained to look for this disease inside patients who already carry another autoimmune diagnosis. More researchers are finally treating seronegative patients as a population worth studying instead of a dead end. And for the first time in this disease's documented history, there are multiple treatments sitting in late-stage trials, any one of which could give this condition something it has never had. A real, dedicated answer, instead of a borrowed one. None of that erases the years already lost by the people who lived through the sicker gap before things started to shift. But it means the file isn't closed for the people living through it right now, and it isn't closed for you. There's a second part to this investigation I haven't told you yet, and it's the part that made me the most uncomfortable to research. It's about the specific warning signs that show up on the body long before any blood test ever will, the ones almost nobody is taught to look for. That's next.